This is the third of three lectures on Marcel Proust's Swann's Way. This particular lecture will focus on the inset within the novel, the great novel of 3,000 pages, 7 volumes, entitled Swann in Love. Now, the greater work is entitled In Search of Lost Time, and this is, in effect, a novel within a novel, and it's often read separately. Because the story of Swann, as I've said in the previous 2 lectures, is really a story that parallels the story of young Marcel, and their lives are very similar, at least insofar as they experience love and the love affairs that they enter into. And so this is a really wonderful little novel that, again, as I said, can be read by itself, but it's much one will have a much greater appreciation of it reading it within the context of the larger work that Marcel Proust wrote, and of which this is just one small portion. Now, there you can see a picture of Marcel Proust. Again, he was born in 1871 and died in 1922. I've also included a photograph here of Stéphane Mallarmé, who would have been in the generation roughly before that of Marcel Proust. You see he lived from 1842 to 1898. Proust was acquainted with Mallarmé, and I mention him because Mallarmé's little poem La Cygne, or Le Swann, which was published in 1899, certainly provided some inspiration for Marcel Proust in his thinking of this figure of Charles Swann, who is the main character in the story Swann in Love, whose name is Swann, which is, again, an English word, although spelled in this case with 2 N's rather than 1. Now, in the case of the poem by Mallarmé entitled La Cygne, it's worth noting that in Mallarmé's poem, it's a wonderful little poem. It's one of those poems that are effectively not translatable, or very, very difficult to translate, because it's a poem that is based on a homophone, or play of words between the word cygne, which means swan, but spelled differently. It sounds the same. Cygne also means sign. And in Mallarmé's poem, it's a poem about a swan, a white swan who's stuck in the ice and is trying to break free from the ice. But it becomes a kind of a metaphor for the creative process as well, because much like the swan is stuck in the ice and is not able to rise up out of the ice because of the frost and the snow that he's struggling to free himself from. The sign also is something that this was effectively a poem about writing a poem, because the sign is something that's trying to rise up off of the white sheet of paper, much like the swan is trying to rise up out of the white ice. Now, Swann, one of the things that Charles Swann has in common with the young Marcel in Proust's novel is that both of them have aspirations beyond being mere social climbers, artistic, aesthetic aspirations. In the case of young Marcel, he wants to write a novel. He wants to be one of the great writers of his day. In the case of Charles Swann, he has ambitions to become an art critic and to write particularly about a painting, the painting of the painter Vermeer. But he just never gets around to it. He gets too occupied with his life of social climbing. And so too does young Marcel abandon his aspirations to become a writer, because he believes he simply doesn't have the talent to do it. As I said in the previous lecture, he's unable to give himself credit. And so the larger work by Proust is metafictional as far as it's a novel about writing a novel, or let's say a novel about not being able to write a novel. And this is also the theme of Mallarmé's great poem on the Swan. But what's, of course, ironic is that in both cases, they've done precisely that. They've given us wonderful works of literature that have overcome the problem of the inability, or the, say, writer's block, or the inability to create. So I mentioned Mallarmé. Certainly, Marcel Proust had him in mind in his creation of this character, Charles Swann, and his poem, Mallarmé's poem, La Cygne, is most definitely worth a look. He's a wonderful French poet. Now, this is an image on the left from the ballet Swan Lake, in which one of the main characters is named Odette. This also, remember, at the time that Proust's novel was written, this is at the apex of the industrial fantasy ballets, the Tchaikovsky ballets. This is prior to the coming of the Ballet Russe to Paris, prior to the advent of modern dance. And some of the ballets, like Parade, that say Picasso got involved with, and the ways in which Nijinsky and Fokine, and under the directorship of Sergei Diaghilev, were able to create an entire new form of dance. It's interesting to note in passing that Sergei Diaghilev, who was the impresario of the Ballet Russe, which had such a profound influence on modern art, was also responsible for introducing Marcel Proust and James Joyce, the only time that they ever met, just once at a dinner that Diaghilev arranged, and neither one of them had read each other, and they spent in the brief time that they spoke, they just talked about their poor health. But I mention all this to say a couple things. One, ballet is very important at this time, and Proust's novel, his Belle Epoque novel, his novel of the Belle Epoque, is written at the era when classical ballet is also at its apex. Now classical ballet is a metaphysical art. It was George Balanchine who said ballet is woman, and in the most important scene in the pas de deux of the classical ballet, when the male and the female dancer dance together, Balanchine's view, this very traditional view, was that the task of the male dancer was to support the female dancer, and when they would sort of come to this opening, this clearing, and something extraordinary would happen, much like the story that we discussed in our last lecture, when young Marcel is walking along the Maze Église Way and comes upon Gilberte Swann, and he sees her, but he doesn't see her. He sees something other than her. He thinks that she has blue eyes, for instance. In fact, her eyes are quite black. But what is it that he's seeing when he sees her? And this is a very interesting question to reflect upon. In philosophical terms, one could speak of the who and the what. Does he see what she is, or does he see who she is? Is this a question of her very essence or her being? Does, for instance, a great ballerina disclose her essence as beautiful in the art of ballet, in the pas de deux? Well, whether or not events of this nature occur, these metaphysical sort of events, certainly this was an era in which these orientations, metaphysical orientations to the beautiful, prevailed. And we're going to see that Proust, in his thinking of both art and beauty and love, is profoundly Platonic. And so while Proust has proven influential to contemporary post-structuralist thinkers like Deleuze and the Frankfurt School theorists like Theodore Adorno and Walter Benjamin, he nonetheless, his thinking is fairly traditional in its metaphysical orientation. He's quite Platonic, and so thinking Proust through a Platonic lens can be a very helpful way of understanding also what's going on. We'll come back to this as we look at particular passages in the narrative, which are clearly Platonic in the way in which Proust is thinking about the question of essence, or the question of the beautiful as something that is essential, or truth being a matter of beauty that discloses itself in a temporal sense. Now, on the right there, you see an image painted by Degas. That's the ballet master. And ballet was a great theme of the Impressionist painters as well. And so this is an era of ballet. Proust himself went to ballets, including the ballets of the Ballet Russe, and like so many others of who lived in Paris at this time, he was profoundly influenced by them. So let's begin by looking at what happens when Swann first meets Odette. Now, Swann, as he's described in the novel, is a bit of a cad, which means that he likes to he's a womanizer. In effect, he has affairs and then he breaks them off and disappears unexpectedly. And when he first meets Odette, he's not even that impressed with her, and it's through a slow process by which he falls in love with her. But at first, he's not even that much, even that much impressed with her. But let's read how Marcel Proust describes his first encounter with Odette, the woman with whom he's going to become quite obsessed, and later marry, who will become the mother of Gilberte Swann, who later becomes the wife of Robert de Saint-Loup in Search of Lost Time in the greater narrative. Swann was introduced to Odette de Crécy by an old friend of his own who had spoken of her to him as a ravishing creature with whom he might very possibly come to an understanding. Now, note she's a courtesan, which is to say she mingles with the aristocracy, but she's essentially a prostitute. She's a woman who's been groomed, and when we get her fuller story, we hear how she was from a very young age, in effect, groomed to become this bewitching courtesan in order to make her fortune. But had made her out to be of harder conquest than she actually was, so as to appear to be conferring a special favor by the introduction. Now, Odette, when Swann first sees her, struck Swann not certainly as being devoid of beauty, but as endowed with a style of beauty which left him indifferent, which aroused in him no desire, which gave him, indeed, a sort of physical repulsion, as one of those women of whom every man can name some, and each will name different examples, who were the converse of the type which our senses demand. To give him any pleasure, her profile was too sharp, her skin too delicate, her cheekbones too prominent, her features too tightly drawn. Her eyes were fine, but so large that they seemed to be bending beneath their own weight, strained the rest of her face, and always made her appear unwell or in an ill humor. So he's not even that physically attracted to her. He's not that impressed with her. He's been told that she's quite beautiful. He's not so sure himself. In any case, she's not his type. And but slowly he's going to be drawn into her world. He's going to move, as we'll see, from a state of indifference to a state of obsession, and he becomes greatly jealous of her every action. Here's a Renoir painting. You can see images of what, typical images of the beauty of women and of this era. This was, again, pre-modern. As we saw in the last lecture, and when I say pre-modern, I mean I'm placing modern, the beginning of the modern. If we wanted to place a rough date on it, we could say, well, the advent of World War I and its aftermath, which caused so many profound upheavals in society, the Roaring '20s, which, as we saw last time, Marcel is going to find very repulsive compared to the era of the Belle Epoque, or the pretty era. So this is an era in which women have not begun bobbing their hair and are dressed in more traditional fashion. In England, this would be the Victorian age. Odette de Crécy came again to see Swann. Her visits grew more frequent, and doubtless each visit revived the sense of disappointment which he felt at the sight of a face whose details he had somewhat forgotten in the interval, not remembering it as either so expressive or, in spite of her youth, so faded. He used to regret, while she was talking to him, that her really considerable beauty was not of the kind which he spontaneously admired. But after Odette had left him, Swann would think with a smile of her telling him how the time would drag until he allowed her to come again. He remembered the timid, anxious way in which she had once begged him that it might not be very long, and the way in which she had looked at him then, fixing upon him her fearful and imploring gaze, which gave her a touching air beneath the bunches of artificial pansies fastened in the front of her round bonnet of white straw, tied with strings of black velvet. And won't you, she had ventured, come just once and take tea with me? He had pleaded pressure of work, an essay, which in reality he had abandoned years ago, on Vermeer of Delft. Now, in the early phases of their love, now remember, Odette has been groomed, trained to be quite the coquette, and she's very successful. She has one conquest after another. She's quite good at luring men into her snares because this is what she's been trained to do. And she has, natural charms as well, of course. Swann is at first indifferent to him. He's even amused. He sees her sort of play acting, and he watches her, and he also is somewhat condescending to her. And we're going to see how the power roles are going to be reversed as time goes by, and as he falls more and more in love with her, and she becomes more and more indifferent to him. Now, the essay I mentioned that, like the young Marcel, Charles Swann has ambitions to do more than just hobnob with high society, to not fritter away his time in following social pursuits that are essentially meaningless. He thinks about, well, I would like to write an essay on this painting by Vermeer of Delft. Now, here you see the painting. This painting is a very important painting in terms of the larger novel as a whole. Marcel Proust keeps coming back to this painting over and over again throughout the narrative. So it's not just important for Charles Swann, it becomes also important for Marcel and other characters as well. Now, Vermeer was a very great painter indeed, a Dutch painter. He didn't paint too many paintings because every painting that he painted was so painstakingly created. It took him a great amount of time. And Swann and others are going to become obsessed with, particularly with the way that Vermeer is able to work with light. So if you look very carefully at the image, in the painting, and this is a pre-impressionist painting, it has, there are places in it where the light shimmers and shines, much like in some of the best paintings of Cézanne. And so again, this hints at a kind of a metaphysical dimension, if we can think of this notion of a kind of a glow, a shine within being, and this is a way of thinking about the beautiful that is very ancient and very traditional, yet still continues to inform art in the late 19th century. Let's say prior to the 20th century, in which metaphysical ways of thinking about beauty become increasingly suspect. But we're not in that era. Not quite yet. And Proust, although he published as a contemporary of André Breton, that was then towards the end of his life, and really his work is more accurately placed within the context of the late 19th century, at least in terms of the setting. Now, in terms of the generic content of Proust's novels. Certainly, he is a modernist in his sensibility. He's a figure who effectively invents the modern novel, along with, say, Joyce, Gertrude Stein, Kafka, and others. So he's one of the great, really, truly great modern novelists. But yet he's writing about the late 19th century, which is still not really completely. We're not completely in the modern period, at least not in the way that I'm using it as something that emerges in the great collapse in values that takes place after World War One. Gertrude Stein will call those who are writing and painting at that time members she calls the lost generation. Proust is not by any means a member of the lost generation. He precedes that. In World War One, what happens, the great tragedies that take place in World War One, don't really affect him too deeply. He's already his vision is already fixed and determined by that point. Now, this is again Marcel Proust writing about Swann. Now, no doubt, in thus remembering their conversations and thinking about her, Odette, that is, thus when he was alone, he did no more than call her image into being among those of countless other women in his romantic dreams. But If thanks to some accidental circumstance, or even perhaps without that assistance, for the circumstance which presents itself at the moment when a mental state hitherto latent makes itself felt, may well have had no influence whatsoever upon that state, the image of Odette de Crécy came to absorb the whole of his dreams. If from those dreams the memory of her could no longer be eliminated, then her bodily imperfections would no longer be of the least importance, nor would the conformity of her body, more or less than any other, to the requirements of Swann's taste, since having become the body of her whom he loved, it must henceforth be the only one capable of causing him joy or anguish. So we might think about this again, this Platonic distinction between being and becoming, or what seems to be versus what is. And so it's his love for Odette is finally not a matter about mere appearance, because as we're going to see, often her appearance is at odds with even with his idea of her. And so there's even a discrepancy or a gap that opens up between what she appears to be, or what she seems to be, and who she really is. And so part of why Swann becomes so obsessed with her is because he's effectively enraptured by the very essence of who she is. This is a very Platonic way of thinking about love. Love as being, we can think of this, for instance, in the case of Phaedrus, when Socrates claims that he loves Phaedrus not just for whom he appears to be, but for whom he really is, as opposed to, say, his rival Lysias, who is enraptured with Phaedrus's appearance but doesn't care at all about who Phaedrus really is. Well, Swann is deeply becomes deeply in love with Odette, and it's more than it's based on more than how she merely appears. Question that we have to ask is what is he really seeing when he looks at her? And this is something that we'll consider as we look more carefully at some of these passages. Now, in the previous lecture, we mentioned Ventaya, and he was a man who lived in the same village as Marcel and Swann. And Ventaya was a composer, very modest man, and Swann even knew him, but he didn't know him to be the composer with whom he becomes obsessed as the author or the writer of this composition, which contains the sonata that is so interesting to him, and which is going to become associated with his love for Odette. Now, in the first part in Combray, we learn that the daughter of the composer is in a lesbian relationship with a young woman, and he's somewhat, despite the fact that he's a gifted composer, he's quite a bourgeois in his moral sensibilities, and he's mortified by this, and he suffers a great deal because of his daughter's promiscuity. And so part of what is going on in the sonata is that it speaks of beauty, but it also speaks of suffering. And at first, Swann is only attentive to the discovery of the beautiful, of the composer, and he just hears on the cusp of it the sadness, but he gradually becomes more attuned to the anguish that is latent within the composition when his love for Odette becomes more anguishing as well. Here's how this happens. How this sonata becomes a part of his love for Odette, or becomes mixed up with his love relationship and strengthens his love for Odette. Marcel Proust tells us that the year before, at an evening party, Swann had heard a piece of music played on the piano and violin. At first, he had appreciated only the material quality of the sounds which those instruments secreted, and it had been a source of keen pleasure when, below the narrow ribbon of the violin part, delicate, unyielding, substantial, and governing the whole, he had suddenly perceived where it was trying to surge upwards in a flowing, tide of sound, the mass of the piano part, multiform, coherent, level, and breaking everywhere in melody like the deep blue tumult of the sea, silvered and charmed into a minor key by the moonlight. This time he had distinguished quite clearly a phrase which emerged for a few moments from the waves of sound. It had at once held out to him an invitation to partake of intimate pleasures, of whose existence, before hearing it, he had never dreamed, into which he felt that nothing but this phrase could initiate him, and he had been filled with love for it, as with a new and strange desire. So this music really works on him in a very profound way. We're going to see that what the way in which Marcel Proust is going to conceptualize this is that Ventaya is a discoverer of this phrase that he discovers is an eternal verity that he has discovered within himself, but because it is something more than merely an ephemeral truth, it's also something that his listeners can have within themselves as well, and this is the case for Swann as well. It awakens something within him, and he becomes quite obsessed with this musical phrase that and the way in which it repeats itself or it recurs within the context of the greater composition. Indeed, this passion for a phrase of music seemed, in the first few months, to be bringing into Swann's life the possibility of a sort of rejuvenation. He had so long since ceased to direct his course towards any ideal goal, and had confined himself to the pursuit of ephemeral satisfactions, that he had come to believe, though without ever formally stating his belief even to himself, that he would remain all his life in that condition which death alone could alter. So again, he's given up his ambitions. Like Marcel, the boy, he is he's frittered away his ambitions, but he has these moments where they awaken within him the thought that possibly he could do something more than just waste his life in empty pursuits. But it's precisely hearing this phrase, this musical composition, and the repetition. I mean, when the sonata is played for him, that he that it awakens this longing within him to also be an artist of sorts, to do something more with his life than waste it doing nothing. More than this, since his mind no longer entertained any lofty goals, he had ceased to believe in, although he could not have expressly denied, their reality. He had grown also into the habit of taking refuge in trivial considerations, which allowed him to set on one side matters of fundamental importance, just as he had never stopped to ask himself whether he would not have done better by not going into society. But now, like a confirmed invalid, whom all of a sudden a change of air and surroundings, or a new course of treatment, or as sometimes happened, an organic change in himself, spontaneous and unaccountable, seems to have so far recovered from his malady that he begins to envision the possibility, hitherto beyond all hope, of starting to lead, and better late than never, a wholly different life. Swann found in himself, in the memory of the phrase that he had heard in certain other sonatas which he had made people play over to him, to see whether he might not perhaps discover this phrase among them, the presence of one of those invisible realities in which he had ceased to believe, but to which, as though the music had upon the moral barrenness from which he was suffering a sort of recreative influence, he was conscious once again of a desire, almost indeed of the power to consecrate his life. But never having managed to find out whose work it was that he had first heard played that evening, he had been unable to procure a copy, and finally had forgotten the quest. So when he first hears the sonata, he's very obsessed with it. But he can't find out who composed it, and time goes by, and he forgets about it altogether until he's going to hear it played again for him unexpectedly at the salon with the Verdurins when he's accompanying Odette. And this is going to have an enormous psychological, existential impact upon him. And I want to go back and read again this quote about this, what Proust is calling here the presence of one of those invisible realities in which Swann had ceased to believe. So again, we're going to see that the way in which Proust describes the artist, whether the artist is a painter or a musician or a novelist or a poet, whatever kind of artist the artist is, the artist is, Proust is going to describe as a kind of a explorer who journeys into these strange and distant lands and brings back these discoveries to us. But the discoveries that he brings back are discoveries that he finds within himself, and that Proust believes we all of us have within ourselves. And so this is a universal. This is a Platonism. This is a way of thinking about these metaphysical realities that the artist is who's dedicated enough is able to find through very diligent effort, and brings them back to the world to enjoy. And so Swann feels that he's in the presence of this. Again, it's an invisible reality that he, when in his more jaded moments, had ceased to believe, but suddenly he becomes awakened to these truths that are greater than what is a mere passing illusion. All right, Proust describes the Salon of the Verdurins as being, as I said in the last lecture, a kind of a profane parody of the more sacred image of the family as a clan, as a kind of a group or a gathering or a little clan, as he describes them, his family in Combray. And so the Verdurins want desperately to bond together that group of friends who come to their salon, but they can only do so through excluding in oftentimes very vicious ways others who they call rather arbitrarily snobs. Anybody who doesn't belong to their little group is reviled, and in some cases they'll expel people who they don't regard as being sufficiently loyal to them. And so Odette belongs to their little circle, and she asks if she can bring Swann along with her to one of their soirees. And this is the soiree where Charles Swann hears the sonata played once they give Odette permission to come. But Swann is on parole. In effect, they they're checking him out. They don't know quite what they think about him. And at first they're okay with him, but later Charles Swann becomes one of the figures who's expelled from their salon. And so what becomes a wonderful way at the beginning for him to meet and encounter Odette in society later becomes an obstacle to their love, because Odette will continue to associate with the Verdurins after Swann is no longer able to. But he's at the Verdurins the first night he's at the Verdurins. He is there, and this sonata is being played, and he's with Odette. And this is, again, a kind of a revelatory moment for him when he hears again this wonderful composition that he had heard but forgotten about. Tonight at Madame Verdurin's, scarcely had the little pianist begun to play when suddenly, after a high note held on through 2 whole bars, Swann saw it approaching, stealing forth from underneath that resonance, which was prolonged and stretched out over it like a curtain of sound to veil the mystery of its birth, and recognized, secret, whispering, articulate, the airy and fragrant phrase that he had loved. And it was so peculiarly itself, it had so personal a charm, which nothing else could have replaced, that Swann felt as though he had met, in a friend's drawing room, a woman whom he had seen and admired once in the street and had despaired of ever seeing her again. Finally the phrase withdrew and vanished, directing, diligent among the wandering currents of its fragrance, leaving upon Swann's features a reflection of its smile. Now this is Proust is going to describe this song as it becomes the national anthem of their love, of Swann and and Odette's lover. It's their song, in effect. Many people have sort of their songs, and this is going to become the song of Swann and Odette, or the music of Swann and Odette, which then later he's going to ask Odette obsessively to play for him back at his apartment. But now at last, Swann could ask the name of this fair unknown, and was told that it was the Andante movement of Vinteuil's sonata for the piano and violin. He had held it safe, could have it again to himself at home as often as he would, could study its language and acquire its secret. It passed with simple and immortal movements, scattering on every side the bounties of its grace, smiling ineffably still. So now he knows what it is. He's secured it. He doesn't now. He hasn't associated it with Vinteuil of his village, that this man with the daughter who suffers, but he now can play it any time that he wants, and he's so happy. He says, but also this time he hears something he hadn't heard before in the music. And let's read how Proust describes this. But Swann thought that he could now discern in it some disenchantment. It seemed to be aware how vain, how hollow was the happiness to which it showed the way. In its airy grace there was indeed something definitely achieved and complete in itself, like the mood of philosophical detachment which follows an outburst of vain regret. But little did that matter to him. All right, well, little did it matter to Swann now. He detects this other dimension to the music, which is deeper than he first realized, and which may point to a possible sadness, a sadness that prefigures the sadness that Swann is going to feel as well in his love for Odette. But at this point, he doesn't think about that, because he's just so happy, and his love affair is reaching its apex with Odette. And certainly he spends a lot of time in her company, and he treats her with a kind of a ceremony, which is with exaggerated courtesies. Remember, I said she's a courtesan, which is to say she's a woman of easy virtue, but he doesn't treat her like that. He treats her like she's a rare and precious object. And this is a source of amusement to the members of the salon at the Verdurins, who know Odette for what she is, whereas he's treating her as if she's just the most precious and rare of all women on earth, and he's falling ever more desperately in love with her. And Odette, of course, is aware of this, and she uses this to her advantage. Now, he's going to find out later that she was never faithful to him, that all the time that he was enraptured with her, she was off with other men and women alike, and was hardly loyal to him alone. But he's blind to this. He only has eyes to see her. And again, the question that we have to ask is, what is it that he's really seeing? He's much, again, like young Marcel along the garden path, who sees Gilberte Swann and thinks that he sees a beautiful little girl with blue eyes. In fact, he's looking at a girl with black eyes. And so the process of falling in love is something that is happening within himself. And this is what Plato calls the greatest blessing that the gods bestow, the gift that the gods bestow upon us. And yet, love is a kind of a madness in this Platonic sense. That it's a form of suffering as well. We're going to see that Charles Swann suffers terribly in his love for Odette. But remember, this kind of suffering is also a suffering that gives meaning to his existence. And so it is a suffering, but it's a suffering that brings him happiness in its own way. Now, Swann, Proust tells us, was struck by Odette's resemblance to the figure of Zipporah, Jethro's daughter, which was seen in one of the Sistine frescoes. And we're going to see this is one of the habits of Swann, is that when he looks at all kinds of people, men, women, butlers, maids in the kitchen and so on. He thinks of paintings. He always compare. He has this habit of comparing the people that he encounters with paintings that he's seen in museums and churches and so on. And so he's going to associate Odette with this painting of Jethro's daughter. And I'll show you an image of it in just a moment. Swann had always found a peculiar fascination in tracing in the paintings of the old masters not merely the general characteristics of the people whom he encountered in his daily life, but rather what seems least susceptible of generalization, the individual features of men and women whom he knew, as for instance in a bust of the Doge Verdurins by Antonio Rizzo, the prominent cheekbones, the slanting eyebrows, in short, a speaking likeness to his own coachman, Remy. So he compares his driver, his coachman, to a bust that he sees by the sculptor Rizzo. And similarly, in the case of Odette, this is, we can see here, Jethro's daughter, this woman with blonde hair, as you can see there, that this is for him, when he looks at Odette, this is what he sees. But in effect, Odette doesn't really, and even Swann is even aware of this, is that this is an idealized version of Odette. He sees an essence, an essential beauty. In reality, her physical appearance, doesn't really match quite often with the image that he sees of her, thinks of her when he associates her with this painting by Botticelli. Swann told himself that in choosing the thought of Odette as the inspiration of his dreams of ideal happiness, he was not, as he had until then supposed, falling back merely upon an expedient of doubtful and certainly inadequate value, since she contained in herself what satisfied the utmost refinement of his taste in art. The words Florentine painting were invaluable to Swann. They gave him, as it were, a legal title to introduce the image of Odette into a world of dreams and fancies which, until then, she had been debarred from entering, and where she assumed a new and nobler form. Indeed, an ideal form. This is again, when I speak of the essential Odette, an ideal Odette. She's now entered into this realm of dreams and fancies, in which she has become more than who she appears to be, but something that is ideal in effect. And whereas the mere sight of her in the flesh, by perpetually reviving his misgivings as to the quality of her face, her figure, the whole of her beauty, used to cool the ardor of his love, those misgivings were swept away, and that love confirmed now that he could re-erect his estimate of her on the sure foundations of his aesthetic principles. While the kiss, the bodily surrender, which would have seemed natural and but moderately attractive had they been granted him by a creature of somewhat withered flesh and sluggish blood, coming, as they now came, to crown his adoration of a masterpiece in a gallery, must it seemed prove as exquisite as they would be supernatural. So he's head over heels, and he's making love to Odette, he loves more than what she seems to be, what he thinks that she is. Now, whether she is what he thinks that she is, or there really even is for her to be other than what she appears to be, is an entirely different question. But he's enraptured. His love for her is a transcendental love. And when he was tempted to regret that for months past he had done nothing but visit Odette, he would assure himself that he was not unreasonable in giving up much of his time to study an inestimably precious work of art, cast for once in a new, a different, and especially charming metal, in an unmatched exemplar which he would contemplate at one moment with the humble, spiritual, disinterested mind of an artist, at another with the pride, the selfishness, the sensual thrill of a collector. So he begins to give up everything. He gives up his relationships in society. He withdraws his friends who are, these that he hobnob with the Guermantes, for instance, Madame de Guermantes, they don't know what's going on with them. They think this, and because they know, they've heard about Odette, and like the Verdurins, they pretty much got the picture of who this woman is. And this is also, it's platonic, but it's also his way of thinking of Odette. We can think of it as Kantian in the sense of this idea of beauty being in the eye of the beholder. Now, the way Kant will formulate this is that when we're in the presence of the beautiful, the most that we can say about the beautiful form or object, woman or man, or a work of art, is that it's as if it has an essence. We don't to say that there is really an essence, that there is a there beyond what merely appears to be, is something that we can only have faith in the way Kant's going to argue, because to make a kind of claim beyond that becomes a matter of dogmatism. But we can certainly say that for Charles Swann, it is as if Odette has a radiant essence. She is to put it in Gadamerine terms, she is the sensuously abundant object who is beautiful, but for Swann. And if beauty is in the eye of the beholder, Kant's going to argue that we experience the beautiful form as if it's a universal, in a psychological sense, as if it's a universal experience. It doesn't mean, however, that others have that same feeling that we have, or the same attraction that we might have for the beloved. But the source because the experience is one that appears to be universal. Again, putting this in Kantian terms, Swann is terribly jealous all the time, because he imagines that all men feel the same way about Odette that he does, which simply isn't the case. Now, one exception is his friend, the Baron de Charlus, who he allows to spend as much time as possible with Odette in society, because he knows that his friend, the Baron de Charlus, is not interested in women. He's homosexual, so he feels safe having her in the company of the Baron de Charlus, but not with any other man. So this is a very Platonic. Here, this is an image of Plato and Aristotle in the Academy. It's a very Platonic way of thinking about love. If you're interested in pursuing this further, again, Plato's Phaedrus is the canonical instance of this, where the idea of Platonic love is articulated when Socrates confesses his attraction for Phaedrus, but doesn't act upon it. But he feels a sense of rapturous bliss in the presence of Phaedrus. But this is a similar feeling that Swann has, although he does act upon his passion, but it's one that makes him suffer. Remember, Lysias tells Phaedrus, Lysias, who competes with Socrates for the love of Phaedrus, he tells him, look, Lysias advances to sort of a friends with benefits argument when he says, let's just have sex with one another, and we won't do all the crazy, stupid things that lovers do when they fall in love, and we'll enjoy the pleasures of sex without this agonies of love. And Socrates, when he repeats the speech of Lysias, he wants to, in effect, wash his mouth out with soap, because he thinks it's a very profane speech. And he gives an apology to Eros, the god Eros, or Cupid in Roman mythology, because when the arrows of Cupid strike us, they certainly make us suffer, but this suffering is the greatest gift that the gods bestow upon us in Platonic terms. And indeed, it's what even later, when Swann falls out of love with Odette but marries her nonetheless, he regards the moments of his suffering as what were the best moments of his life, because they provided him with a profound sense of meaning. That's a very Platonic idea. It's a very Platonic way of thinking about love. Now, on his study table at which Swann worked, he had placed, as it were, a photograph of Odette, a reproduction of Jethro's daughter. He would gaze in admiration at the large eyes, the delicate features, in which the imperfection of her skin might be surmised, the marvelous locks of hair that fell along her tired cheeks, and adapting what he had already felt to be beautiful on aesthetic grounds to the idea of a living woman, he converted it into a series of physical merits which he congratulated himself on finding assembled in the person of one whom he might ultimately possess. So he's, again, think of young Marcel who comes upon Gilberte and sees a blue-eyed girl, but in fact she's a black-eyed girl. He doesn't even put a photograph of Odette on his desk. He places a reproduction of Jethro's daughter and looks at it, and as if that is the photograph of Odette. He's looking at an ideal Odette. Odette, is aware of this, and she manipulates this his love for her. When she knows that he's in love, she takes him for everything that he's worth. The vaguest feeling of sympathy which attracts a spectator to a work of art, now that he knew the type in warm flesh and blood of Jethro's daughter, became a desire which more than compensated thenceforward for that with which Odette's physical charms had at first failed to inspire him. When he had sat for a long time gazing at the Botticelli, the painting, he would think of his own living Botticelli, Odette, who seemed all the lovelier in contrast. And as he drew towards him the photograph of Zipporah, he would imagine that he was holding Odette against his heart. Now, we might think of Zipporah here, or the Jethro's daughter, as being the idea. This is the idealized Odette, and then we have the actual Odette. This is very similar to, like, if we take, for instance, the story of the Golden Ass of Cupid and Psyche, in the Apuleius novel, the little, again, novel within the novel, much like in this case the novel within the novel of Swann in Love, in which Venus is the idealized, is the goddess, and Psyche is the doppelganger of the goddess, and so in effect, Odette is the doppelganger of Zipporah. Zipporah is the ideal, essential woman with whom Swann is obsessed. Odette is the reality. Here's another Botticelli painting. Botticelli is the same painter who painted this Zipporah's daughter, and you can see here this dynamic clearly enacted in this image of Venus, of whom Psyche in the Apuleius story is a kind of a doppelganger. So this is the goddess of love and beauty, and we might think of her as being, this is what Valentine's Day is, a celebration of her. So she's associated with love, and indeed, Swann is certainly been struck by the arrows of Venus's son Cupid, and he is, or Eros, and he is no longer he's out of his mind. In effect, he's struck with this divine madness. It's not. We could tell Swann, pull it together, get yourself together. This is what his friends are saying to him, like, what are you doing with this woman? But he's in the throes of an experience that is not rational, that can't be described or approached in rational terms. And indeed, this is what it is. This is what it means to be in love. It's not a matter of logic. Now, Marcel Proust was somewhat skeptical or pessimistic even about friendship, about why we even have friends in the first place. This is an interesting theme in the narrative. I won't get into it too far. Kant again is going to say a true friend is a black swan. I think Marcel Proust's views about friends were similar. He did have friends, but a true friend. Usually there's something we want out of friends. This is going to be the view of Marcel Proust anyway. But without totally giving up on the idea of friendship altogether, but thinking more of the true friend as a kind of a black swan. But here is the way that Marcel Proust articulates this. He says, other people are, as a rule, so immaterial to us that when we have entrusted to any one of them the power to cause so much suffering or happiness to ourselves, that person seems at once to belong to a different universe, is surrounded with poetry, makes of our lives a vast expanse, quick with sensation, on which that person and ourselves are ever more or less in contact. Now, this is again kind of, I mean, what he's saying is that we're all, in effect, more or less obsessed with ourselves, that we're all a bit narcissistic. We don't really spend a lot of time thinking about others. Perhaps we should. But when somebody with whom we fall in love then gets to us in this way, it throws us into confusion because it's not our normal way of associating with others. Now, Swann could not, without anxiety, ask himself what Odette would mean to him in the years that were to come. So he's thinking about the future. He's desperately, deeply in love with her now, but when he looks to the future, he thinks, what's going to happen? He's afraid that his love for Odette will die. And we're going to see later he wants it to die because he's suffering so terribly, and yet his love dying would be the worst thing to happen to him. And so he wants, he wants to remain in this state of suffering. And when he thinks about the future, he wonders what will happen. And it's very interesting what happens when you get to the Guermantes Way, the next novel. Excuse me, the L'Ombre de Jeune Fille en Fleur, Moncrief translated as Within a Budding Grove, but the corrected translation is in the shadow of in the shadow of young girls and flowers. Literally, how you translate. I can't remember the Kilmartin title, but in any case, Odette Swann marries Odette beyond the point when he's no longer in love with her. It's almost like a wholly different. It's like this Swann is not the same Swann at all that we see either in the early pages of Combray or in Swann in Love. And Odette too is a completely different character. And one of the things that we learn, there's an interesting scene in the Combray section where young Marcel goes and visits his uncle, and there's a courtesan who is there at his uncle's place, and his uncle's greatly embarrassed because his uncle's somewhat of a ladies' man, and he knows that of the bourgeois scruples of Marcel Proust, or Marcel, not Proust, but the character Marcel's family, and he knows that they would not be happy if the young boy met this essentially a prostitute in his house or his apartment. And of course, young Marcel goes home and tells his parents everything, and this causes this break that is never healed between his family and his uncle. It's the last time, effectively, that he sees his uncle, except once when he passes him on the street in a carriage. And it's a terrible, sad little anecdote, but we learn much. We don't know this at the time, but much like we don't know that Odette is, or that Gilberte Swann is also Madame de Saint-Loup, we also find out later that the very courtesan who's visiting Marcel's uncle is, in effect, Odette. And so it's interesting that the characters change, and Swann himself fears the death of the Swann whom he is at this moment. And but this Swann will die, and a new Swann will emerge. And this Swann is beyond care. He doesn't even care about high society anymore. The only reason why he later cares about high society at all is because he wants to introduce his daughter into it. But he becomes a much more vulgar figure than we find in the more refined Swann of Swann's Way. Now, physically, Odette was passing through an unfortunate phase, we're told. She was growing stouter, and the expressive, sorrowful charm, the surprised, wistful expressions which she had formerly had, seemed to have vanished with her first youth, with the result that she became most precious to Swann at the very moment when he found her distinctly less good looking. Well, this is quite interesting. The greater the discrepancy between, his ideal vision of her as Zipporah, or we could say, again, Venus, Psyche, the more he's attracted to her. He would gaze at her for hours on end, trying to recapture the charm which he had once seen in her and could not find again. And yet, the knowledge that within this new and strange chrysalis, it was still Odette, or we could say Zipporah, that lurked, still the same volatile temperament, artful and evasive, was enough to keep Swann seeking with as much passion as ever to captivate her. Then he would look at photographs of her taken 2 years before and remember how exquisite she had been. And that would console him a little, for all the sufferings that he voluntarily endured on her account. And so, like all human beings, she's aging, but he has locked in his memory this moment of of the apex of her beauty, or the epiphany of her beauty, when she was the embodiment of the goddess, in effect. Now, in the evenings, the he'll have her play the sonata for him in his apartment. Now that he knows the composition, he knows the name of the composer and can gain access to it. And she plays it terribly, but he doesn't really even care. Let's read how Proust described this. It was true that Odette played vilely, but often the fairest impression that remains in our minds of a favorite air is one which has arisen out of a jumble of wrong notes struck by unskillful fingers upon a tuneless piano. The little phrase was associated still in Swann's mind with his love for Odette. He felt clearly that his love was something to which there were no corresponding external signs, whose meaning could not be proved by any but himself. He realized, too, that Odette's qualities were not such as to justify his setting so high a value on the hours he spent in her company. Now, again, so there's a part of him that knows what his friends know, and she's not the woman that he thinks that she is. So he's fully aware of this, but it just doesn't matter to him. Watching Swann's face while he listened to the phrase, one would have said that he was inhaling an anesthetic which allowed him to breathe more deeply, and the pleasure which the music gave him, which was shortly to create in him a real longing, was in fact closely akin at such moments to the pleasure which he would have derived from experimenting with perfumes, from entering into contact with a world for which we men were not created, which appears to lack form because our eyes cannot perceive it. This is, again, we're back into this notion of the realm of the metaphysical ideal realm. To lack significance because it escapes our intelligence, to which we may attain by way of one sense only. He would make Odette play him the phrase again, 10, 20 times on end, insisting that while she played, she must never cease to kiss him. And then she gets flustered, says, "How can I kiss you and play at the same time?" I mean, she knows that he's just nuts, and she doesn't, she sometimes expresses her frustration with him, and it gets, as the days go by, it gets increasingly pitiful as the power dynamic changes in their relationship, and he's almost in a kind of a masochistical, painful situation for Swann. But he's happy because there's also this process of awakening that's taking place within him. For Swann was finding in things once more, since he had fallen in love, the charm that he had found when in his adolescence he had fancied himself an artist, much like, again, Marcel. With this difference that what charm lay in them now was conferred by Odette alone. He could feel reawakening in himself the inspirations of his boyhood, which had been dissipated among the frivolities of his later life. But they all bore now the reflection, the stamp of a particular being. This is Marcel's story as well, and Marcel will be able to find the strength to recover the inspirations of his boyhood and the aspirations to become an artist. And during the long hours, which he now found a subtle pleasure in spending at home, alone with his convalescent spirit, he became gradually himself again, but himself enthralled him to another. So it's a very interesting way to think about it. His old self, the self of his boyhood, has reawoken, but we could put this in metaphysical terms, even let's say Heideggerian terms. We could say he's held within the grip of being. He's gripped. His very being is under attack. He is enthralled, but what he is enthralled to is to Odette, with whom he cares, for whom he cares about very deeply. Now, this is an image of a white swan. I want to recall to your mind the Mallarmé poem that I mentioned previously. This idea of we could think of this in terms of the senia, or the swan, is again the sign that that the artist struggles to bring from the blank sheet of paper. They can think of the poet trying to write the poem not coming. This is a poem. This is a poem about impotence. In effect, Mallarmé literally the Swann can't get it up. So we can think, well, he's wanting the sign to emerge, and it's not coming forth. It's not arising forth. But on the other hand, we know that this is a poem that is finally written, and so it does arise. It does come forth from the blank sheet of paper, and so too, Swann. We can think of this idea of we hear the idea. Think of Odette being a kind of a muse. We can think of her as a muse to Swann. We know this is a very old story how artists have their muses, like let's say Picasso, who had a succession of women in his life that became muses for him. Now this is a lot of this has become a source of criticism for feminist theory, but this is effectively what's happening with Swann. As we can think of Odette as a kind of a muse for him, who's awakening in him something very profound, and he needs his muse just as Homer needed his muse. Examining his complaint with as much scientific detachment as if he had inoculated himself with it in order to study its effect. He, Swann, that is, told himself that when he was cured of it, what Odette might or might not do would be indifferent to him. But in his morbid state, to tell the truth, he feared death itself no more than such a recovery, which would in effect amount to the death of all that he was then. So again, he knows that he's suffering from this sickness, which he can regard, which he views with even a kind of a scientific detachment. But he doesn't want this self that he has become in the presence of Odette, this reawakened self who cares, as opposed to the jaded Swann who no longer really cared much about anything. He doesn't want this self to die. At the moment when he was just going to be finally cured, feels himself to be misunderstood by the doctor, who does not attach the same importance to these pretended contingencies, mere disguises, according to him, assumed so as to be perceptible by his patients, by the vice of one and the morbid state of the other, which in reality have never ceased to weigh heavily and incurably upon them while they were nursing their dreams of normality and health. And as a matter of fact, Swann's love had reached that stage at which the physician, and in the case of certain affections, the boldest of surgeons, ask themselves whether to deprive a patient of his vice or to rid him of his malady is still reasonable or indeed possible. Now, really, he's got it so badly. It's like if this is extracted from him, he feels he may die too, and he's as we're going to see later, he's beyond the point. He's inoperable effectively. But he thinks about his sort of sickness, his love, which is also kind of a sickness, or it becomes this metaphor of love as a sickness becomes even more profound in the latter pages of this novella. But as he begins to analyze himself, he knows he can't. He's stuck. But he says, really, sometimes he says, I'm making distinct headway, he would tell himself on the morrow. When I come to think it over carefully, I find that I got hardly any pleasure last night out of being in bed with her. It's an odd thing, but I actually thought her ugly. And certainly he was sincere, but his love extended a long way beyond the province of physical desire. Now we've seen that. It's not just a matter of how she appears, or what she seems to be. Odette's person, indeed, no longer held any great place in it. When his eyes fell upon the photograph of Odette on his table, or when she came to see him, he had difficulty in identifying her face, either in the flesh or on the pasteboard, with the painful and continuous anxiety which dwelt in his mind. He would say to himself, almost with astonishment, "It is she," as when suddenly someone shows us in a detached, externalized form one of our maladies. So it's even if she's become a personification of his illness. She's a walking, to put it in allegorical terms, she's a walking illness that is that confronts him. And we find in it no resemblance to what we are suffering. He tried to ask himself what that meant. For it is something like love, like death, rather than like those vague conceptions of maladies, a thing which one repeatedly calls in question, in order to make oneself probe further into it, in the fear that the escape will find no answer, that the substance will escape our grasp, the mystery of personality. And this malady, this sickness, which was Swann's love, had so far multiplied, was so closely interwoven with all his habits, with all his actions, with his thoughts, his health, his sleep, his life, even with what he hoped for after his death, was so entirely one with him that it would have been impossible to wrest it away without almost entirely destroying him. As surgeons say, his case was past operation. Or in the Moncrief translation, the Kilmartin translation, it was inoperable. So it's fatal. This will pass. This will pass for him, but he's suffering. She goes away, and he even longs that to hear that she will be killed in some accident. That would be a quick. I mean, he doesn't want to kill her, but if somehow she conveniently were to die, that's the only thing that could possibly release him from his sufferings. This is a similar thought that's going to enter the mind of young Marcel when he becomes obsessed with Albertine and suffers so greatly. As he says, I just wish something would happen to her, because he can't, she's run away from him. He can't get over his love for her. He's just stuck. If indeed at this period it often happened, though without admitting it even to himself, he longed for death, it was in order to escape not so much from the keenness of his suffering as from the monotony of his struggle. And yet he would have wished to live until the time came when he no longer loved her, when she would have no reason for lying to him, when at length he might learn from her whether on the day when he had gone to see her in the afternoon she had or had not been in the arms of Forcheville, one of his rivals. This time will come to him, but at this point in the narrative, he can't imagine this to be so. Often for several days on end, the suspicion that she was in love with someone else would distract his mind from the question of Forcheville, his rival. And of course, she's sleeping with him. She's sleeping with a lot of people. There were even days when he was not tormented by any suspicion. He fancied that he was cured. But next morning, when he awoke, he felt in the same place the same pain, a sensation which the day before he had, as it were, diluted in the torrent of different impressions. But it had not stirred from its place. Indeed, it was the sharpness of this pain that had awakened him. Now, this is a Toulouse-Lautrec painting of the era, or drawing, and this would be the kind of style. This could even look a bit like Charles Swann. This could be kind of a figure of what he might have looked like. And this is we're going to go now into what I regard as the most important moment of the narrative, which is again a kind of an epiphany. I'm using this Joycean term, much like the epiphany that took place when the young Marcel dips the Madeleine into the tea. This is the moment when what's basically happening. What we're going to read about now is that Swann goes into a salon. Odette is off on a cruise with the Verdurins, and he hasn't seen her in some time. He's still in love with her, however, and he hasn't gone into society for a long time, and he doesn't even look like himself anymore. And his friends are wondering what's happened to him, and think that he looks pathetic and sick even. But he comes into society at last, and he hobnobs with some of his old friends who he hasn't seen in a long time. And when he comes unexpectedly, there is a small orchestra that plays or gathering of musicians that play this sonata for him, and he wants to run away when he hears it, but he's stuck, and he has to listen to it. And it's this moment of realization that takes place within him at this salon. Swann suffered overwhelmingly to the point at which even the sound of the instruments that he heard made him want to cry from having to prolong his exile in this place to which Odette would never come. She wouldn't come because she wouldn't be welcome, much like, his daughter's not going to be welcome because of his disreputable mother, which he tries to make happen, in which nothing was aware of her existence, from which she was entirely absent. But suddenly it was though she had entered. Odette had come into the room, almost like a specter. And this apparition tore him with such anguish that his hand rose impulsively to his heart. What had happened was that the violin had risen to a series of high notes, on which it rested, as though expecting something, an expectancy which it prolonged without ceasing to hold on to the notes, in the exultation with which it already saw the expected object approaching. The little phrase is approaching. And with a desperate effort to continue until its arrival, to welcome it before itself expired, to keep the way open for a moment longer, with all its remaining strength, that the stranger might enter in as one holds a door open that would otherwise automatically close. And before Swann had had time to understand what was happening, to think, it is the little phrase from Vinteuil's sonata, I mustn't listen, all his memories of the days when Odette had been in love with him, which he had succeeded up till that evening in keeping invisible in the depths of his being, deceived by this sudden reflection of a season of love, whose sun, they supposed, had dawned again, had awakened from their slumber, had taken wing and risen to sing maddeningly in his ear. These verities are awakening, which he's been suppressing for so long within himself in her absence. Without pity for his present desolation, the forgotten strains of happiness. And Swann could distinguish, standing motionless before that scene of happiness, in which it lived again, a wretched figure, which filled him with such pity, because he did not at first recognize who it was, that he must lower his head lest anyone should observe that his eyes were filled with tears. It was himself. He certainly has a moment of self-revelation, a moment of illumination, and he's going to become aware in a much deeper way, of the kind of sadness that is latent within the composition. But he has a fuller appreciation of its meaning as well, and a fuller understanding of his own life, of his own existence through this process of suffering that he's undergone, and that the music has helped him to understand. As though the musicians were not nearly so much playing the little phrase as performing the rites on which it insisted before it would consent to appear. This is the appearance of the god. It's like Deus Machina, that the god appears, as proceeding to utter the incantations necessary to procure and to prolong for a few moments the miracle of its apparition. Swann, who was no more able now to see it than if it had belonged to a world of ultraviolet light, who experienced something like the refreshing sense of a metamorphosis in the momentary blindness with which he had been struck as he approached it, Swann felt that it was present like a protective goddess, a confidant of his love, who, so as to be able to come to him through the crowd and to draw him aside, to speak to him, had disguised herself in this sweeping cloak of sound. And indeed, whereas in that distant time he had divined an element of suffering in its smile, in its limpid and disillusioned intonation. This is, again, he's personifying the music. Tonight he found there rather the charm of a resignation that was almost gay. This is really an important passage. Let me read this again. He found there in this phrase the charm of a resignation that was almost gay. And this is going to be what happens to Swann himself, is that he becomes resigned, and this resignation, it's like, it's a release, that the one that makes him feel very happy, gay, and light of heart, of those sorrows of which the little phrase had spoken to him then, which he had seen it without his being touched by them himself, carry past him, smiling on its sinuous and rapid course, of those sorrows which were now become his own, without his having any hope of being ever delivered from them, it seemed to say to him, as once it had said of his happiness, "What does it all matter? It is nothing." And Swann's thoughts were borne for the first time on a wave of pity and tenderness towards that Vinteuil, towards that unknown, exalted brother, who also must have suffered so greatly. What could his life have been? Now, the irony is that we know as readers what his life was, and we know what the cause of his suffering was. In that scene, for instance, where after his death, his own daughter spits on his photograph. His daughter, who he loved so much, who caused him to suffer, and Swann in the same way has loved deeply and also suffered deeply. And he knew him too, but he didn't know who he was. He didn't it was in his own mind. He had constructed a different Vinteuil. From the depths of what well of sorrow could he have drawn that godlike strength, that unlimited power of creation? Now, this is the composer who Proust is saying he has a godlike strength because he made this very profound discovery, and Proust thinks of himself in these terms as well. As he was sickly, he suffered, he didn't think he had the talent, but he rose to the challenge through a kind of a godlike strength to make the discovery that was the discovery of the novel that he wrote, and the truths that he discovered in the writing of this novel. But ever since, more than a year before, discovering to him many of the riches of his own soul, the love of music had been born, and for a time at least had dwelt in him. Swann had regarded musical motifs as actual ideas of another world, of another order. Ideas veiled in shadows, unknown, impenetrable by the human mind, which nonetheless were perfectly distinct from one another, unequal among themselves in value and in significance, when they awaken in us the emotion corresponding to the theme which they have found, of showing us what richness, what variety lies hidden, unknown to us, in that great black impenetrable night, discouraging exploration of our soul, which we have been content to regard as valueless and waste and void. All right, so this is it's very metaphysical notion of these more profound truths that are said to be latent within us, that the great artist is able to discover. And by metaphysical, this means that they're timeless. They're outside of time. They're beyond time, and that is precisely what makes them eternal. But as such, their existence, again, as I said with reference to Kant, is something that one can only believe. If such essences exist, by definition, they don't disclose themselves in the realm of appearance. But Proust affirms that they do exist, and this is precisely what gives comfort to Swann in his suffering. Even when he was not thinking of the little phrase, it existed latent in his mind in the same way as certain other conceptions without material equivalent, such as our notions of light, of sound, of perspective, of bodily desire, the rich possessions wherewith our inner temple is diversified and adorned, the inner temple of ourself, our psyche, our soul, in effect. Perhaps we shall lose them. Perhaps they will be obliterated if we return to nothing in the dust. But so long as we are alive, we can no more bring ourselves to a state in which we shall not have known them than we can with regard to any other material object. Then we can, for example, doubt the luminosity of a lamp that has just been lighted, in view of the changed aspect of everything in the room, from which has vanished even the memory of darkness. This is quite interesting. So he does say, now let's go back. He says here, maybe we shall lose them. I mean, for instance, if we think of these verities that the artist discovers as metaphysical, eternal, he does throw out this notion. He says, well, look, maybe when we die, maybe at the end of the day, we die, we go back to non-being, we're just nothing at all. There's no life after death. But even so, if that's the case, then we'll bring these with us to the grave, and they will have they will have nurtured our lives nonetheless. And so they, regardless of whether or not they are, again, there's a more kind of a reservation in this sense. It's not a naive affirmation of this metaphysical essential ideal realm. It's simply saying that there are truths that the artist discovers, and the discovery of them is partly what makes it bearable for us to live in this world. And that's a kind of a Nietzschean idea, aesthetics as kind of a redemptive illusion. Here is an image from the Rosetta Stone, and I mentioned in the first lecture that Proust was alive during the great French imperial era, when they were colonizing the world. This is the era of their greatness, also the era of their plundering and despoiling of the possessions of lands and peoples that didn't belong to them. You go to Paris today, you'll see obelisks and Egyptian artifacts and other things, other African masks and so on, that were taken from the time of imperialism, that are housed now in France. And this raises all kinds of questions about whether or not these objects of this nature should be returned. Now, this is the Rosetta Stone. This is not housed in France, but it was during the Napoleonic conquest of Egypt that the Rosetta Stone was discovered, and it was a French Champignon who cracked the code. So if you look at the Rosetta Stone, you'll see at the top the hieroglyphs. In the middle is the Demotic. This is the cursive Egyptian hieroglyphic writing, and at the bottom is the Greek. And it was this discovery that enabled the knowledge of the hieroglyphs to be unlocked, which had been lost for almost 2,000 years. The knowledge of how to read hieroglyphs was unknown, and so this mythological notion of them came into being. This idea that hieroglyphs were an esoteric kind of sacred language that belonged to the priests. In fact, they're alphabetic like any form of writing, although they have a pictographic quality as well. It's a complex writing system, but this was not known, and so this mythology arose of these hieroglyphic signs as being unlocking the keys to these kinds of eternal mysteries and verities, much like those that Proust is discussing with reference to the sonata. And so Proust will later, not in this part of the novel, but later in the longer 7-volume version, will even make express reference to these hieroglyphs as a kind of a metaphor for these eternal verities that exist within us, that the great artist discovers and translates for us. So, for instance, to put it again in Platonic terms, we might think of these eternal ideals as being something embedded within our soul, but we don't have the ability to decipher them. I have them, you have them, or let's say Vinteuil has them, Swann has them, but it's the musical composer who is able to unlock them by translating them into a language that then Swann can understand. But when he understands them, he's reading essentially what is already within himself. And this is also the point that Proust is going to make about even the act of reading. At one point, he's going to say the only real true voyage of discovery is seeing the world through the eyes of another person. But what makes when we read the novel for Proust, what we're doing in effect is one of the reasons why we so feverishly turn the pages, is because because the novelist who is the authentic, let's say, genius or great novelist, is the one who has deciphered, unlocked this code within himself and translated it into a language that then we ourselves can understand. And so when we read the novel, we're essentially not reading what we are reading, or we're reading is what is within already what is within ourselves. And so too in the case of the sonata, the Vinteuil had discovered a truth that was within himself, but was also within Swann. So this is the aesthetic sensibility of Marcel Proust. It's a metaphysical orientation to the arts. to all of the arts. But again, I do remind you that he does throw out this sort of cautionary idea. That he says, well, look, maybe there isn't this. Maybe this realm isn't eternal and unchanging. Maybe there is no timeless realm that is beyond the realm of mere appearance. And yet there are these truths that exist that the artist discovers. And for Proust, they're as real as he say, as a light, a light that we see, a lamp. Because we experience them in a sensual way. We has, let's say, a psychological, sensual, empirical experience of these truths that the artist discovers, whether it's a musician or a poet or a painter and so on. Its destiny was linked for the future with that of the human soul, of which it was one of the special, the most distinctive ornaments. Now, perhaps it is not being that is the true state, he acknowledges. Okay, again, remember the basic concepts of metaphysics: being, non-being, and becoming. So he's saying, well, maybe, what's what Plato calls core, the realm of nothingness or non-being. Maybe that's all there is, nothingness. Maybe that's the true state, he throws out. And all of our dream of life is without existence. Maybe there's nothing beyond what merely appears, what seems to be. But if so, he says, and this is where he qualifies it, we feel that it must be that these phrases of music, these conceptions which exist in relation to our dream, are nothing either. We shall perish, but we have for our hostages these divine captives, which shall follow and share our fate. And death in their company is something less bitter, less inglorious, perhaps even less certain. And this is why the artists are so important for us, and this is what they do for us, is that they bring meaning to our existence through their discoveries. So Swann was not mistaken in believing that the phrase of the sonata did really exist. Human as it was from this point of view, it belonged nonetheless to an order of supernatural creatures whom we have never seen, but whom, in spite of that, we recognize and acclaim with rapture when some explorer of the unseen contrives to coax one forth, to bring it down from that divine world to which he has access, to shine for a brief moment in the firmament of ours. This was what Vinteuil had done for the little phrase. So Swann, again, even after he even after his love for Odette has run its course, I felt there's actually a filmed version of the Swann in Love with Jeremy Irons and Alain Delon that I do recommend. Because it gives you it's like it's a 1984 film. It gives you a wonderfully visual sense of the era of La Belle Epoque. And there's a scene at the end, which I thought was very nicely done, where Charles Swann and Baron de Charlus, Charles Swann played by Jeremy Irons, Baron de Charlus played by Alain Delon, are talking about they're older now and they're reflecting back, and they say, it was, Swann says, look, it was, she made me suffer and I'm a different person now, but that was what gave my life meaning. That love affair that I have, it was what brought happiness and meaning to my existence. But he does say, this is the funny last line of the novella, the novel within the novel. Now that he's had this epiphany and he has this more gay sort of resignation and moved on, in effect, he says, he thinks it's kind of funny. He says, to think that I've wasted years of my life, that I have longed for death, that the greatest love that I ever known has been for a woman who did not please me, who was not in my style. Or in the Kilmartin translation, I didn't even like her. She wasn't even my type, and yet, she was the love of my life, and that's, it's a wonderful little novella. Now, again, when you read the Proust novel, his story is a much longer and protracted version of this same love affair. That's why, if you don't have the patience for the 7,000 page novel, 3,000 page novel, thank goodness it's not 7,000, the 3,000 page, 7 volume novel, if you don't have the patience for all of that, Yet again, many readers find it very, very rewarding. I know I certainly do. I've read it a number of times. Um, that nonetheless, the little story by Charles of Charles Swann and Swann and Love does very nicely encapsulate many of these same themes, and I think you can get the essence of what Proust is about through reading that. But I think most readers is that once they get through Swann's Way and they get past the sometimes off-putting, really long, complex sentences and the many digressions in the narrative, that they get hooked, and then they become fervent admirers of Proust. There's even a book that came out in the New York Times not long ago. It was maybe 10, 20 years ago. I don't remember exactly, but something like how reading Proust can change your life. So people become quite obsessive about Proust. Now there on the right, you see the grave of Proust. This is at Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris, same cemetery where Edith Piaf is buried. Jim Morrison, many other luminaries are buried there. And so you can go visit and put a flower on the grave of Marcel Proust as well.